Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
And Rory, we are still in Chicago.
We are indeed, yep.
For the DNC, Democratic National Convention. Let's start with something election-related from somebody called RV. Following Rachel Maddow is a presenter on MSNBC, recent piece on Republican electors in the US who will refuse to certify state elections if needed. What are your thoughts on how Trump could try and subvert the US election results to win, including potential interference from Russia?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that will be unfamiliar to a lot of European and British listeners. The American system is obviously very, very constitutional, and these decisions are based on micro interpretations of the electoral rules. And in this particular case, it seems that a lot of people who are on the Trump side are trying, and in the case of Georgia, appear to have succeeded in actually changing state laws so that electors, instead of merely being, or either electors or even election counters, instead of merely being neutral transmitters of results, have the independence to make their own minds up about whether or not results are valid. And of course, the problem with that is that there are more than 30 officials who refused to certify the last election, who've been reconfirmed as electoral officials, and a general sense that across the states, Republicans are already preparing themselves for the possibility, if Trump were to lose, that they would refuse to certify, and that would then push the decision to probably a Republican-dominated Congress, and Trump would try to get in that way. Over to you.
I got out of bed this morning and walked down for breakfast, and on the television, Donald Trump was on the news, and the rolling thing at the bottom said, Trump, I'm better looking than Kamala Harris. Okay?
Do you agree with that?
No. I don't think many people would agree with that. And I sort of feel like he's losing the plot. Now, we've got to be very...
You would say that that's not the key message at the moment.
I
if you were trying to
think
win
his
an election.
advisors would be saying, what you want to do is get on the news and say, I'm better looking than her. Now, I think that sort of stuff about Trump used to be quite funny and used to be quite interesting. And I think he's just become incredibly boring. And I've noticed a lot of people who used to find him quite compelling, sort of turning off.
Can I just stop you on that? My memory of this is that he would generate these completely daft statements every day, 2015, 2016, and by doing so, get the media attention. I mean, his objective is he wants to see himself on Twitter. We'll see himself at the bottom. And your sense is that actually, after 8 years of this, people are just losing attention, losing interest, and he can say whatever he wants, really, and nobody's actually going to pick up.
I think so. I mean, you got to be careful, because here we're in Chicago, surrounded by Democrat city, surrounded by Democrats, all of whom have got the vibe. But we bumped into a guy this morning called Dan Boltz, who is a veteran Washington Post journalist. He used to be in London. He was telling me, I don't know if he's giving a secret, he's 78 and he's still their sort of chief correspondent. But he was saying he was at Milwaukee for the Republican convention. He's now here. He said it's the first year he can remember where both parties felt like they were absolutely on the march. But of course, what's changed is the big change. Joe Biden stepping down, Kamala Harris now going for it. I think it was interesting listening to Anthony Scaramucci and Katty Kay the other day, both of them still saying this thing is too close for comfort from the Democrats' point of view. I think that's probably right. You can find people who say, hold on a minute, don't rule this guy out. But I just sort of feel that this week will show whether the Democrats still have this momentum. I sort of feel the wind is going out of his sails. It feels like that.
And then I guess the problem for international listeners is whether to see this stuff about Trump and Republican states lining up officials to refuse to certify valid elections is something to be seriously worried about, which of course is the view of many, many Democrats. Or is this a hysterical conspiracy theory generated by liberals? And in fact, this isn't actually going to happen.
Well, the only thing about that is you just have to go back to what happened last time. Hang Mike Pence, storm the Capitol. So I think it's within him never, ever, ever to admit defeat. I also think, by the way, that is why it's so important that the Democratic Party does keep this momentum going and they win big.
Because if they win seriously big, then these silly tricks won't help him.
Although I'm not comparing the United States to Venezuela, but we sort of said that about Venezuela. If they win big, he won't be able to claim, Maduro won't be able to claim he's won. They did win big. Maduro claims he won.
But I guess in that case, Maduro controlled the release of the results. In this case, Trump won't control the release.
This will be done by a body that most sane people will think is doing a decent job. Listen, you mentioned Georgia there. Let's go to the other Georgia.
Yeah, the Georgia, for listeners, which is between Armenia, Azerbaijan and Russia, a pretty tricky place to be in the world.
Yeah. Wendy Shannon, would you be able to offer an explainer on what's happening in Georgia right now? There is not a lot of media coverage. And we also got questions about Bulgaria and Slovakia. I mean, I think it is worth just saying this because, we've talked about Viktor Orban quite a lot, leader of Hungary. So you've got to see the situation going here. Georgia, the big thing there, massive protests against this foreign agents law, which is totally based on a Russian law and modelled on Hungary. If you're an NGO, if you're basically taking foreign money from countries like America or Britain, you are a foreign agent.
That then means if, for example, you are an election observer, and many of the election observers receive foreign money.
Yeah.
If you are any of these classic NGOs, which is so important getting civil society going, so there's German things like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or Soros's Open Society Foundation, or any of these groups, Human Rights Watch, etc., but also local groups. So in the case of Russia, it was human rights organizations that received foreign funding. Very, very difficult often for civil society organizations in small countries to have the funding to really hold governments to account without raising some money internationally. This cuts them off the knees, but particularly potentially cuts off the election observers from an election coming.
Yeah, but it's the fact that it's so clearly modelled on something that they have seen work elsewhere, in inverted commas. So you've got that going on in Georgia. Then in Bulgaria, you've just had a new law passed, which it brought to mind Thatcher's Section 28, the promotion of homosexuality in schools. But it's another anti-LGBT thing, which is also happening in Slovakia. And in Slovakia, you've got a culture minister who, and it's one of these things where it's not entirely clear whether she is doing this completely with the support of Robert Fico, the Prime Minister. She's called Martina Simkovichova, and they're essentially purging from senior positions in the arts people who are not utterly committed to the government and to its values. And she says these things which, so for example, the National Theatre Director's gone, the National Gallery Director's gone, and their crime is pursuing progressive liberal political activism which does not conform to the heritage of our ancestors.
So I think, and this is something maybe we can get into in a bit more depth, I mean, there are two very related stories around populism here. But one of the big differences is some of these countries are members of the European Union.
Bulgaria.
And some of these countries are not.
Slovakia.
And so Bulgaria and Slovakia, and to some extent even Hungary, are slightly more constrained in what they can do. The much more dangerous places potentially still are Georgia, where there is this Russian oligarch called Ivanishvili, who basically controls the whole thing.
Yeah.
Moldova, which has been through a very tricky, unstable time. Serbia, where now, and we talk about Serbia, we keep reminding people of Serbia, recent poll, 32% of young Serbs are now in favor of a military invasion of Kosovo compared to 22% of young Serbs against. Croatia now looking at introducing compulsory military service because of the potential threat from Serbia. So
not as an internal security thing. Not as a sort of right-wing populist thing.
No.
As a defensive thing.
As a defensive thing.
Yeah.
But I think one of the cases that my friend, who I'm very keen to introduce you to, Gerald Knaus, would make, who's a huge enthusiast for European Union enlargement, is he would say, despite all the troubles in Hungary and elsewhere, actually the fact that populists were defeated in Poland, the fact that Romania has gone on a remarkably positive journey in some ways. Romania in the 90s, people will maybe remember, gangsters, secret service, massive corruption charges, anti-Semitic politicians being elected. Now it's done better in per capita GDP in many other countries, relatively stable. The Baltic countries doing very well. Yeah. So a lot of former Eastern Europe that went, and this is a credit, he would say, to Tony Blair and EU accession, Britain pushing a lot of this, were brought into the European Union after 1989.
Isn't that interesting? Because of course the argument against that is that is what led to the immigration that led to Brexit, that led to Britain's decline.
So he would say what you achieved was something really important in terms of stability, democracy, economic growth, that actually apart from the oil-rich states some of the fastest economic growth in the world has been those new European Union member states in Eastern Europe, and that if Blair and others had not pushed to bring them in, those states would be like, Romania would be like Belarus, Bulgaria would be like Moldova or Georgia, and that actually it's a really smart strategic move that's made for a much more stable, prosperous world.
It's very hard to see how. So Serbia, we talked about, as you say, a lot. Serbia, which says it wants to join the European Union, yet is pointing so much more towards Russia now. And likewise, it's very hard to see how Georgia, doing this foreign agent stuff, and so clearly also pointing towards Russia in terms of the way it's conducting its politics, how that helps. Or do you think they've just sort of parked the idea of joining the European Union?
Exactly. So just to remind listeners, this was in some ways quite interesting and exciting. Georgia suddenly the EU approved it to be on an accession track and started talking about Georgia joining NATO and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And it really felt as though Georgia had really becoming a Western friend. But in the recent rhetoric over the last few months, it's sounding more and more pro-Russian, more and more anti-US, more and more anti-EU. And if it's turning up in the EU at all, it's turning up at Orban conferences talking about the decline of the West. So I think it's very, very sad. It seemed for a moment as though Georgia might be a success story. But yeah, I think it's a reminder that all these things are on a knife edge. And again, as I think we discussed in our interview with Albin Kurti, the leader of Kosovo, had Serbia been brought into the European Union, it's possible that it would be much more like Slovakia or Bulgaria, which is a slightly populous, unstable, but not an existential threat, not a country thinking of invading one of its neighbors. By remaining outside the EU, some of these countries can be profoundly dangerous.
Final point on Georgia. This in the week when Yvette Cooper, the British Home Secretary, was talking about violence against women and girls and misogyny possibly coming under terrorism legislation. In Georgia, they've got this history of releasing secretly filmed explicit videos of women politicians and journalists and trying to shame them and push them out of public life. And they've just also now removed quotas for women in parliament. So misogyny is becoming a bigger force. So that as an attitude now within this kind of politics, where also immigrants coming under greater attack, people of colour coming under greater attack. And back to Slovakia, one of the things that the culture minister there is saying is that the LGBT community is sort of undermining the white race. Now, how they mix up race and LGBT, I don't know. So all of this stuff goes back to this kind of, it is the sort of Putin-Orban playbook.
It is. And the smartest person in this story still seems to be Orban. You saw him at the football. And one of the things I've now realized he was doing when he wasn't being polite to you at the football is he was charming all the big German companies. He continues to know that his bread is buttered on big German factories, Mercedes-Benz, etc., investing heavily into Hungary.
He was certainly getting his picture taken with quite a few of the sponsors, I'd have to say that.
So gentle, social democratic, progressive German businessmen are still putting their money into Hungary. So he's able to play it both ways. He can sound pro-Chinese when it suits him, pro-Russian when it suits him, very pro-Trump. He's talking about he wants Trump to win not just one, but 2 more terms in his latest speeches. This is Orban. But at the same time, he's just about staying on the right side of the law. I mean, but, there is still very weird stuff going on. You would have seen at some of the football matches, some of his supporters carry flags of ancient Hungary, which includes quite a lot of Romania. But because he's part of the European Union, unlike the Serbs, he's not actually talking about invading his neighbours.
Now here's one, James Mools. What do you think is the most politically significant year of the 21st century so far?
I think 2014. What's your year?
I thought you'd say that. I was going to go 2016.
Because
and I think the most significant day was June the 23rd. I'm really well over it by now, obviously. But
2 things happened in 2016, didn't
Brexit and Trump.
Yeah.
Look, I think we are still living, certainly from the British perspective and the European perspective, with the consequences of both. I think 2014, I can see why you say that, but maybe why don't you just tell our listeners why you think
2014 is the inflection point where we suddenly see Putin invading Crimea and not getting a proper response. We see Narendra Modi elected for the first time in India. We see ISIS taking over Mosul and creating this caliphate. And it's really from 2014 onwards that you can see a distinctly dramatic annual decline in the number of democracies, an increase in the number of refugees, an increase in the number of civilians in conflict, from which 2015 Law and Justice Party in Poland and your 2016 date come. Listen, your 2016 date, though, does relate a little bit to what we were talking about before, because those two things are at the core of the European story. Again, Britain's removal from the European Union is a serious issue for European foreign policy, although Europe, doesn't want to emphasize that too much. Britain played a very important, positive, interesting role on issues like EU enlargement, security in the Western Balkans, which it's no longer playing.
Well, it's interesting. We talked about Project 2025 on the main podcast, and Britain barely figures. Where it does figure, there's a mention of Margaret Thatcher, because there is the Margaret Thatcher Freedom Centre at the Heritage Foundation, which produced this document, and she gets one mention. There is a mention about Brexit, which the Heritage Foundation report essentially says it regrets because Britain had this influence within the European Union, and so many of Britain's positions were aligned with the United States. And it says that America should start, it talks about this trade deal being kind of not going to happen for years and years and years, but it says America needs to get closer alongside the UK before it, quotes, falls back under the orbit of the EU. So that was interesting that we think of Project 2025 as this kind of, mad right wing, etc., lots of which it is. But on that, it was kind of speaking to the point.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that actually many, many Republicans were upset about Brexit and couldn't quite compute that. Okay, here's a question for you from Tom Gorman. We now have the technology to fact check what people say in real time. What would be the merits and demerits of using this in TV debates such as Trump-Harris? Would it be like the VAR in the political world? So I think our friend David Dean was involved in introducing VAR into football. Will you just explain to listeners who aren't football fanatics what VAR is?
Well, do you know what VAR stands for?
No.
Video Assistant Referee.
Okay.
So this is where something happens in the field of play and there is some dispute as to whether it was handball, whether it was a foul, whether it was offside or onside.
And this way you see the referee go to his earpiece because somebody's looking at a television
Somebody's
screen.
looking at it.
Yeah.
In fact, a team of people are looking at it on whole banks of television.
Yeah.
So that's
Does it work in football? And what's the controversy in football? Because some people are against it, aren't they?
Well, lots of people were for it before it happened.
Yeah.
Now that it's happened, my main argument against it is rugby league, which, as you know, Rory, is a wonderful sport, and I know as a Northern MP, you're one big supporter of rugby league. Rugby league is brilliant at using VAR because they make it part of the spectacle. The fans see what the VAR referee is seeing in the same time.
Gotcha.
So it's part of the thing. Whereas in football, you basically stand there, something happens. You celebrate a goal.
Yeah.
And then, oh no, it's gone to VAR. So you have to hang around, sometimes for like 2-3 minutes, while they're looking at every angle.
So it takes the drama out of it.
And people watching on television, they can see what's going on, but the people in the stadium can't. So that's why I don't like it. But I think on balance, it's been quite a good thing. Whether it would work in this context, I mean, in a sense, this is happening already. So that when the TV debates happen, say, between Trump and Harris, millions and millions of people will be watching and social mediaing at the same time. The question, I guess, is whether the TV people should do it in real time. I think there's a case for it because the fact is that normally you'd expect the interviewer to pick up and say, excuse me, President Trump, or excuse me, Keir Starmer, who it might be, that is not factually accurate. Okay. But there's a real danger, particularly with Trump, that he wants that because then he just gets into a fight. So actually having something that comes on the screen, fact check, untrue, I think that could be quite a powerful thing to do.
It would you'd have to develop an institution, wouldn't you? I mean, for it to really work, you'd want a pretty independent institution which would have to develop its rules over time because there'd be a lot of judgment calls. You know, is that something important enough to stop play, as it were, and come in? And of course, all the parties after the debates are going to protest massively if there
about
are
any check,
more fact checks going. So if you think about the Biden-Trump debates, obviously you and I particularly enraged by Trump's nonsense. But of course, Biden, partly because of his age, was saying an enormous number of things which were simply untrue. You know, he would say billions when he meant millions. He'd say thousands when he meant millions, etc. So the screen would have been crowded, exposing all of Biden's mistakes as well.
But go back to what we discussed earlier. I'm better looking than Kamala Harris, says Trump. Well, that's not as it. But when he says things like, I created more jobs than any president in history.
Yeah.
Somebody who's kind of embedded in the facts ought to be able to say that's, fact check, President X actually created more jobs during. But I suppose so much of this stuff is subjective. I guess, I don't know. It's a tough one, that. It's a good question, but I think as we've discussed it, I've realised there are many, many, many downsides. Now, we've just done this, I think, really, really interesting interview with the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas. But there's a question here from Meg Davis. Can we please revisit Nick Clegg's statement that you will not find any studies showing correlation between social media and polarisation in light of several studies like this one, which it took me 30 seconds to find?
And this appears to have a good correlation to the violence on January the 6th. So it's a very, very odd claim. I mean, look, forget research. We experience it in our daily lives. As I keep saying, if I put out a tweet saying, interesting fact, people, call Chicago the windy city, but it's not because of wind, right? I'll get 10 likes. If you say Rory Stewart should be casted off to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, right, I'll get 15,000 likes.
That's often said about me, actually, but not by you yet.
So we experience it, right? And of course, as regular users of X or Twitter, we realize that these algorithms train us as much as we training them, because we begin, if you pay attention to likes and retweets, you begin to realize that the more snappy, outrageous, and provocative you are, the more likely you are to get good responses.
As I, in common with lots of other people, continue this sort of agonizing about whether to just dump the whole thing, I have migrated to Blue Sky.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I noticed...
That sounds a bit boring.
Yeah, but it's quite... Well, I'll tell you something that was interesting. Yeah. So I set up an account, with help, obviously, and I then sort of posted, I think, one post. And then I got an email saying that I'd been suspended.
Oh, you've been suspended from Blue Sky?
Yeah. So I thought, what the hell's going on? So I emailed Blue Sky and said, what the hell's going on? And they said, oh, if you announce on Twitter that this is you, we will reinstate it. But we worried that it was somebody impersonating you. So I then went back on Twitter and I said, I've just done my first post on Blue Sky. Blue Sky saw it and I'm back. But one thing I noticed is that my tree of the day got a lot of love on Blue Sky.
When I post, beautiful pictures of me in Afghanistan and historical buildings on Instagram, I get like crazy number of likes, which doesn't happen on Twitter. But I also slightly worried that Blue Sky's trying to do a marketing trick there. They're trying to get all your Twitter followers. You've got 1 million Twitter followers to notice you've moved to Blue Sky. So it suits them too.
I'm sure that's right. I must say, Leighton Andrews, whose Substack piece we talked about last week or the week before.
On what?
On social media, on how the government doesn't need to change the law. But I think he's got this new word for Twitter, which is shitter, X-I-T-T-E-R. I think it's pretty good, that X. Is that how you pronounce X-I-T-T-E-R?
Shitter. It would be. No,
yeah. So, but I am getting really quite sick of Musk, and also it's just so unpleasant being on there. I don't listen, as you know, I don't mind unpleasantness. I don't mind, and I get the war criminal stuff every day, and it doesn't, it's water off a duck's back. But it's a bit like I said, Trump is boring. I'm finding Twitter really boring.
Getting boring.
I'm not seeing any interesting stuff on there.
Well, because I have these sort of rabbit holes where I do get cheered up, where they're always telling me about some new Neolithic boat they found, or what's happening with some discovery on Neanderthals. But yeah.
I pinged off the Peter Malinauskas interview to Nick Clegg.
And this is him banning social media from children.
Yeah, because he wants to ban social media for children up to 14.
Yeah.
And 14 to 16, there should be parental consent.
So Peter Malinauskas, I was really charmed and thought he was amazing. And indeed, I'm on my way to Adelaide and may try to see him. Couple of things. Some of my Australian friends are saying, be a bit careful with the banning political donations, because they see it as a bit of a move against independent candidates.
I know that's
and a party difficult to get off the ground.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was wondering is, he is such an attractive politician. I mean, he's got a great communication style. He sort of sounds down to earth, accessible. I was wondering, what are the similarities and differences between him and Tim Walz? I mean, are they similar sorts of politicians, kind of regular guys, or is Malinowski more sort of sophisticated than Walz? A different style, is it?
He's very good looking. I'm not saying
Walz is not.
I'm not.
You don't put Walz in the Trump category.
I think Trump is obviously the best looking politician on the planet.
Yeah.
But Peter Malinskis, he's very tall. He's taller than I am. He's sort of really lean and ripped.
Yeah.
He was photographed on the beach during the summer holiday looking pretty ripped.
Right.
But I think he's just got a nice manner, and I think that came through.
And difference with Wolse, apart from what they look like?
Well, I think the look is important because I think that Wolse's appeal is everybody's favourite uncle.
Got you. More sort of down to earth.
Yeah. And so no, I
don't see them as similar.
No.
I just thought both of them are such attractive visions at the moment of what a modern democratic politician could be.
Yeah.
And we don't have equivalents of either of them exactly in Britain. I think generally politicians in most countries come across as slightly strange people, to be polite. Whereas both Peter Malinskis and Wolse come across as relatable, normal people.
The responses we were getting from particularly British listeners who didn't know much about him was overwhelmingly saying that.
Yeah.
Why don't we have politicians who talk like he does, kind of thing. I hope our politicians do listen to people like that and understand that there are different ways of communicating it. Now, what about this one, Rory? Any thoughts on the extent of Nigel Farage's outside earnings, which have now been published? Is it time to ban MPs from having other jobs? And this one from Anne McKinley. Nigel Farage has not been to his constituency since he was elected. Does the MP's code of conduct state how much attention and time should be allocated to his constituents? No, it doesn't. It's up in the end to the electorate, but we did warn you, Clacton, that he wouldn't really be hanging around there very much. In his declaration of earnings, where he's now, I think Sunak is the wealthiest MP, but Farage is the highest earning MP. He's earning over $1 million a year from GB News.
From GB News?
Yeah.
So Paul Marshall is basically funding him to the tune of $1 million a year.
Yeah, and he's also getting funded by all
because
sorts
that's not a profit-making organisation. That is a massive loss-making organisation.
But we know the GB News isn't there to make money. It's there to influence policy.
And this is something I sort of, maybe this is unfair, but I slightly worried also when Boris Johnson was being paid £250,000 to write columns by, I think it's the Barclay brothers. One of the anxieties might be that it's a way of wealthy people paying politicians who they like by employing them in inverted commas to be journalists or news presenters or whatever. Yeah.
He also had to declare who funded him, including some guy who's been to jail for all sorts of stuff, for his foreign travel. And he described his trip to America, this is Farage, as going to comfort or support a friend who'd been shot, even though the friend didn't bother to see him at the time, and represent Clacton on the world stage.
Trump didn't meet Farage, didn't meet his dear friend when he turned up.
No.
How interesting.
But
so you suspect maybe Donald Trump may not be as close to Nigel Farage as Farage suggests?
I wonder that, Rory. Yeah. I wonder. And also he was interested, he talked about this company. This money was paid to his company.
Right.
And I remember when I first left Downing Street, lots of accountants telling me, you really should set up a company, become a company. And of course, you become a company, so as you pay a lot less tax.
I can see a criticism, though, from listeners to this podcast for people saying that you and I are doubtless making a lot of money from our media appearances. But I guess the point is we're not serving members of parliament.
No, we do make way more money than we thought we would. In fact, we'd never even talked about money at the start. With this podcast. But no, my point is he was elected as an MP in Clacton, having tried 8, 9, whatever it was, times to get there. If it's true that he's not been to Clacton once since the election,
it's pretty bizarre.
It is bizarre. It's unacceptable.
It's bizarre. It's a very odd way of putting it.
And it's not on. So if you offer it in Clacton, don't forget. Is my message. Mind you, will he stand again next time? It will depend on whether he thinks he's going to win or not.
It's very, very odd because actually it's the first time he's in Parliament. And generally, at least in their first couple of years, MPs are quite good at spending time in their constituencies.
Yeah, but you've written a book about how awful Parliament is. He's going to hate Parliament. When he walks into Parliament, he is not le grand fromage.
No, and most people will walk out when he speaks. I remember going the one time I think I went to Parliament before I was elected was as a kind of relatively young person. And I remember seeing George Galloway stand up to speak. And most of the Labour benches walked out and all the Tories started talking to each other.
Yeah.
And I saw Galloway, who's of course, a horrible man, but a very, very good speaker.
Yeah.
delivering this incredibly impressive oration in Parliament and absolutely nobody listening. And of course, I had no idea of the backstory. I couldn't understand what was going on. But presumably that's what will happen to Farage, right? Well, he'll have 4 people from his party sitting next to him.
Yeah, and also because he is, though, a pretty good communicator, he probably won't care about that because he will just then clip, post.
Yeah.
He's a media thing. I mean, that's all that Farage is. All he cares about is media.
And this is true, isn't it? Because when you see on Twitter, or when our listeners see on Twitter, a 30-second clip from an MP speaking in Parliament, often the chamber is entirely empty. So I did a speech on hedgehogs.
Famously.
The hedgehog was around long before the human species. 56 million years ago, the hedgehog existed. I ask both sides of this House, because this is not a question that concerns only one party, but all of us. Do we want to have, as our national symbol, an animal which, when confronted with danger, rolls over into a little ball and puts its spikes up? Do we want to have, as our national symbol, an animal that sleeps for 6 months of the year? Or would we rather return to the animal that is already our national symbol? I refer, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the lion. Majestic, courageous, proud.
Seen in Parliament by something like 9 or 10 people.
Yeah.
And then seen, 3 million times on social media. Right?
Exactly.
And unless you are concentrating, you don't particularly notice the fact that the entire chamber is completely empty because they're obviously not that interested at 10 o'clock at night hearing a speech on hedgehogs.
MPs will work out where the cameras are, and Farage will definitely work out where the cameras are.
How to speak.
And if you go near the back, so if you're not a front bencher, you can kind of park yourself anyways. If you go to the back and you've got a big, not that nice old-fashioned wood behind you,
yes,
it could be full.
Could be full. You never know, do you? Okay, Victoria Gray from the Royal Society Literature. Love to hear us speak about the importance of providing access to reading in prisons. How much could this help in resolving problems of critical overcrowding? And then Josh Nightingale found that the ADHD population in prisons is 10 times what it is in the general population, 25% compared to only 3%. What do you think can be done to help people with ADHD currently in prison, prevent people with ADHD going to prison? It's not just ADHD. So 25% ADHD compared to 3% of the population. Something like, when I was prisons minister, 35% of the prison population have been in care compared to 2% of the general population. Maybe a similar number, about a third, have been excluded from school compared to about 2% of the general population. So these are different ways of looking at the fact that prisons are not representative of the general population, and that it's daft to pretend that we shouldn't be looking at where they come from, their childhoods, their mental health, addiction issues, learning difficulties, literacy difficulties, because prisoners remain probably, along with, in many cases deserving their punishment, have inflicted untold misery on the public, but are also themselves often very vulnerable, marginalized people from very screwed up backgrounds.
The best prisons try their best to encourage that kind of stuff. Some prisoners are just going to push it away. Others, it's not the case. I've been in prisons, I know you will have been, where actually you get book clubs, you get art classes, you get people who really kind of try to get into this stuff. I find it really quite strange in the last couple of weeks because, like you, I'm a bit of a liberal when it comes to prisons, and I think far too many people are in prisons who shouldn't be there. But I do think these people that we've been seeing going down for the riots for 2-3 years, although 1 or 2 I see now are being charged with riot, which is a more serious offence than violent disorder. But listen, the government has really got its work cut out in prisons. James Timpson has got a hell of a job.
A hell of a job. And I think one of the low-hanging fruit, if I could cheekily suggest to James Timpson, is that there are so many charities that want to support prisoners. I think there's literally thousands of them. I think at one point somebody told me, I can't quite believe it's true, that there are 12,000 registered charities that work with prisoners.
Really?
But they have real difficulty often accessing the prisons because the prisons are understaffed. There's no prison officer to greet them at the door. The prisons are locked up. They can't see them. So they have all this stuff to provide them. Give a Book, which is Victoria Gray's charity, which works in prisons, a fantastic example of prison charity. If each prison, and there are only about 80 in Britain, had a designated charity liaison officer they could bring in incredible amount of philanthropic and voluntary support into prisons off the back of that. And if a philanthropist listening to this was looking for something they wanted to do which would make an incredible difference, funding the position of a kind of charity liaison officer in a prison would unlock untold amount of volunteers, tens of millions of investment.
Something else I've noticed since James Timson was appointed, because of what he did as a business guy at Timson's, working with people from coming out of prison, is that other firms are now trying to get into that same space. So listen, he's going to have a lot of goodwill, but I think, I know, anybody who's looked at our prison estate recently knows it is going to be very, very difficult and long term to turn the prison around.
We should try to we'll get James onto interview him, but it's going to be fascinating. I mean, so James, his brother was a Conservative MP, so he knows a little bit about Parliament, but I saw a lot of him when he was a businessman and I was the Prisons Minister, and of course he was incredibly frustrated as an outsider at what he saw, understandably, as our uselessness, bureaucracy, and general lack of progress.
Yeah.
Very interesting to see now what he feels when he's there, because he'll find it's very different from being the chief executive of a company, being a junior minister in the Ministry of Justice.
Absolutely, yeah. Now let's stick with prisons in a different place. Charlotte, what do you make of the reports of the treatment of Palestinian prisoners in Israel? Can the international community do anything about it? And this relates to a report that I think you'd seen.
Yeah. Well, the situation in Israeli prisons is very, very disturbing. There are currently 10,000 Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons, approximately. Of those, 4,781 have been detained without trial. No charges, no ability to defend themselves. It could be that they are young men of a certain age who might be considered by the Israeli Defense Forces as potential allies for terrorist groups. Some of them appear to be in purely for posting stuff on Facebook that seems to be critical of the Israeli government. And Beit Salem, which is an Israeli human rights organization founded by progressive Israelis who are critical of the Israeli government, have conducted interviews with 57 of these Palestinian prisoners and have recorded what they believe is an absolutely systematic policy of physical torture, mental torture, deprivation of food, deprivation of water, deprivation of sleep, stripping of personal possessions, 12 people being crammed in a prison cell designed for 6, some of them sleeping on the floor, obviously with no beds, no mattresses, no blankets. And this appears to be in line with the fact that the security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's on the right of the Israeli cabinet, has made it absolutely clear that he intends to make conditions in prisons worse for prisoners. He's trying to hit the absolute legal minimum of provision for Palestinian prisoners, which is leading to this systematic abuse and torture. Related to this, 5 Israeli soldiers are still currently charged for sodomizing a prisoner in a desert camp. The Associated Press, in case people think this is just Beit Salem making this stuff up, has also been conducting interviews with released prisoners, revealing people who are being allowed into daylight for 15 minutes in a period of a few days. One of them hadn't been outside, I think, for 87 days. So this is very, very, very disturbing. Whatever one thinks, heinous attacks by Hamas on October, horrifying terrorist atrocities, but the response from the Israeli government is being challenged and should be challenged, and is being challenged by Israeli human rights groups quite correctly, because this is horrifying stuff.
But I guess the thinking behind Charlotte's question is that, is it really being challenged? And, here we are in Chicago, the biggest demonstration that's going on. There's quite a few demonstrations around the place. The biggest demonstration is about the American administration's position on Gaza, and there's pretty steadfast support for Israel. And the other thing in this context that was, I thought, quite newsworthy and interesting this week was this letter of resignation by a civil servant at the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, Mark Smith, who essentially has said, I've been trying to raise alarm about our system for selling arms to Israel and what they're being used for. I get nowhere, therefore I'm resigning. He's made it public. Now, actually, it didn't make that much of a splash. It didn't, and I think this is the point that we've been making repeatedly, is that this stuff has just become very, very normalised. Now, as it happens, I think David Lammy, he is reviewing this position about Britain's arms sales. Britain's arms relationship with Israel. I don't know when that's coming. I don't know what the decision will be. But I wonder whether Mark Smith's was a deliberate move trying to push in that direction. I'm sure you talked to people in the Foreign Office who are pretty alarmed about this.
Yes, but there is, of course, a consensus between the main political parties in Britain and pretty much a consensus between the main political parties in the US as well, and pretty much a consensus between the main political parties in Germany, which remain pretty steadfastly pro-Israel. And again, I'm very aware that in quoting this report and criticizing the treatment of prisoners, I can see the flood of emails that's about to come in, saying, well, at least we investigate, at least we have human rights groups, at least, we have imprisoned our soldiers for sodomizing people. But I don't think you can get round the fact that the security minister has made it entirely clear
this is a strategy.
This is a policy,
Yeah.
Nor can you get around the fact that almost 5,000 people are detained without trial.
Yeah, or the fact that 40,000 people are dead and they're not all Hamas.
And this is where, in Chicago, we need a very clear sense from Kamala Harris on what she's actually doing. What is her strategy? Because clearly Biden's strategy hasn't worked. And I assume that the way to do this, if she wants to try to hold the two parts of her party together, is to say to Israel, your strategy is not working. This is not the way to win a war. And you're going to have to stop doing this. Yeah. Meanwhile, let's not forget about Lebanon. Let's not forget about the possibility of a war with Iran.
Here's one, Rory. What's happening to votes for 16-year-olds? Why is this hardly mentioned? What should the Conservative Party response be when it comes up again? This is really interesting because votes for 16-year-olds within the Labour Party manifesto.
Yes.
And the question is basically saying, where's it gone?
Yeah.
And
was it in the King's Speech?
It wasn't in the King's Speech.
Oh.
But I think it's important to understand that they're going to be in for a few years.
Right.
So there are going to be several King's Speeches.
Okay.
There's not going to be another general election. So as long as this is in place before a general election.
But sort of tactically, why not put it in the King's Speech?
Because there's so much other stuff to go in there, I guess.
I honestly struggle to really understand, even after the election, what the big ideas of the policy are. What's in this King's Speech? What's Labour trying to do? I mean, I knew, obviously in 2010, we knew, whether we liked it or not, what Cameron and Osborne were about, which was austerity. We knew what Boris Johnson was about, which was supposed to be levelling up, even if he didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
What are we meant to understand Labour's about? At the moment, what we're getting is they've increased, they've met the public sector pay rise. Mm-hmm. They're doing stuff on housing.
Mm-hmm.
They're cutting spending.
The message from the King's Speech that they were trying to land is growing the economy. And I think the big focus on that was planning and building.
Right.
Then it got completely kiboshed by the riots.
By the riots, yeah.
And then since then, we've had Rachel Reeves setting out some pretty tough spending. And I think the one that clearly went down pretty badly in some places was cutting the winter fuel allowance for lots of pensioners.
Which incidentally, I always supported. And many of my Conservative colleagues always wanted to cut the winter fuel allowance pensioners. That was something Gordon Brown introduced, wasn't it? Yeah. And not that we don't think pensioners need support, but my mother's getting the winter fuel allowance, and she would be the first to say she doesn't need it. So wealthy pensioners definitely don't need it. It's something that should be means tested, no?
I'm glad you said your mother rather than me. I'm in that bracket as well. So yeah, I don't particularly want it either.
Okay. And so how did that go wrong, given that Conservatives like me thought that it should be cut and should be means tested?
Because the government is now in opposition. Because the Tories are now in opposition.
Right. So they've all been out campaigning for the pensioners and attacking the government. And that landed, did it?
No, a little bit. They've banged on it about it. I mean, the Tory leadership election isn't really... It's not breaking through to the public, I don't think. I think Tugendhat's made quite a lot of noise.
He's done well on social media. I've been really impressed. So in praising Tom Tugendhat for a moment, I mean, I think he made an exceptional speech in Parliament in Afghanistan, probably one of the best speeches I've ever heard. I've been really impressed by the way he's using social media to communicate his journeys around the country, how active he's being, the people that he's speaking to.
And Jenric's pretty active.
Jenric's been very active too. Tugendhat's just been up in Scotland, so my mother... Chiefly been invited along to hear him speak to the Scottish Conservatives. So, yes, I think Jenric and Tugendhat at the moment seem to be the people who are getting some momentum.
Seems to have a strategy of not doing much and not saying much.
And I guess part of the question is the way in which people handle social media. Because, of course, one doesn't know with any of these candidates, this is true when I was running, exactly how many people are turning up to these events. All you see is a little clip, obviously cut to show as many supporters behind as possible, saying, "Here I am in Godalming, and here I am in Glasgow." And final question, Izzy, how do I spread positivity and hope for the future in my friends and family? The world may be bleak, but I don't want to contribute to the bleakness. I want to fight it.
Good old Izzy. I'm with Izzy.
I'm with Wizzy. So let me try first, then I hand you. I think that there is reason to be hopeful, even about democracy. And I think it's both that actually not all the elections are going in the wrong direction. We're not in a populist hellhole. It's touch and go in many countries, but been good results from Poland. Keep praising the Teal independence in Australia. Decent results in Britain. Le Pen did less well in France. But it's also the moral argument for democracy should inspire us in the future. It's obviously better to believe in equality, human dignity, than it is to believe in grim autocracy, patronizing authoritarian governments. And I think that in the end, the right will still win through. The right in the sense of the correct view will still win through.
Go back to the point I made about that Dan Ball said that, you went to Milwaukee and the Republicans felt they were home and dry. And here we are in Chicago with the Democrats who are all telling each other, let's not get carried away. But one thing is they are completely back in the game. And, when you talk about, I hope Peter doesn't mind me saying, I had a message from Peter Mandelson this morning, who knew I was in Chicago, and he said, every time I see Kamala Harris laugh or smile, I feel a little song in my heart. And she has sort of brought that mood back.
It's amazing.
And, that's not going to put food on the table, but it is giving people a sense of hope. And I think the other thing to say is that you get so much good stuff that, we talk, this is The Rest is Politics. We talk about politics all the time, but there's so much good stuff that happens outside. I mean, I told you last week, it was about how amazing the Olympics were. The Paralympics, I think, were going to be even better. The football season's back, which is always good. Burnley are top of the championship. We've played 2 and scored 9 goals, Rory. So there's loads of good stuff. There are amazing films being made, amazing books being written.
So you're getting it from films, you're getting it from football, you're getting it from the Olympics.
Music.
Yeah, I know music.
Kindness.
Music. So I've just been listening to an amazing, I think it's the 37-hour course by a guy called Robert Greenberg on the concerto, on Baroque and classical
You
music.
listen to 37 hours?
Yeah. And
when?
Well, I haven't got to the end of it. I'm still struggling my way through Bach's Brandenburg Concerti. But the lovely thing about it is you get beautiful bits of classical music, and then he explains what's going on and how it's done, and then you get another bit of classical music. Anyway, that's me. I mean, you don't necessarily want to listen to that, but what I suppose I'm trying to say is that all of us can find joy in our life in very different ways. I was in the New Hampshire mountains yesterday. I didn't have much of a bath or a shower because I was sleeping in one of those wooden huts with 5 other people and the kids and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the trees gave me a lot of joy. I took a picture of a tree, which I'm going to share with you for Tree of the
Tree of the Day, yeah.
Coming on that. So
excellent.
I think for me, trees, classical music, keeping me very happy at the moment. And for you, football, Olympics, swimming still?
Every day.
Every day?
I think the important thing is not to allow yourself to be ground down by all the negativity, even when it feels overwhelming. Now, sometimes I do get overwhelmed by it, and I go off into one of my kind of head funks. But I think that if you go out every day and say, I am going to look for something today that makes me feel better about the world rather than worse, you'll find it very, very quickly. Izzy.
Great end. Thank you.
See you soon.